Senator Angus King introduced a bill today to regulate the sale, transfer, and manufacture of gas-operated semi-automatic weapons. King held a press conference with one of the co-sponsors, Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. King says the bill would be a step toward curbing mass killings like the one in Lewiston, while not infringing on Second Amendment rights of people who own a firearm for self-defense, hunting, or sporting purposes. The bill would limit the number of rounds large-capacity ammunition feeding devices are permitted to carry to 10 rounds of ammunition or fewer. The bill would also make conversion devices, including bump stocks and Glock switches, unlawful. It would also create a voluntary buyback program allowing people who already own guns and magazines banned under the bill to turn them in and get paid.
Neither Martin or I believe that what we're proposing here is a panacea. There are certainly enormous challenges in the mental health field that we need to address. There are challenges in the communication areas where we have warnings of someone's propensity toward violence. What we tried to focus on was the lethality of the weapon, not what it looks like. And the principal focus of our bill is a fixed internal magazine of no more than 10 bullets. And fixed and permanent are the key words.
King says the proposal is being reviewed by many other senators, including Republican colleagues, in hopes for a bipartisan agreement. Maine GOP Chairman Joel Stetzkis released a statement today saying, quote, Angus King is attacking the rights of the people he's getting paid a lot of money to represent. Mainers should speak out against this power grab, unquote. And you can read that full statement on our website.